slammed the mirror to the floor. Not because she wanted to, because her stepmother's words had just carved something open inside her that no physician in all of England could stitch closed. You are nothing. You are ugly, and no man with a title, a name, or even a shred of pride will ever look at you twice. Lady Orabel Thorne stood in the wreckage of shattered glass, breath heaving, hands trembling, the morning light cutting across the veil she wore even inside her own home. Her own home. Except it had never truly been hers, not since the day Countess Drusilla married her father and smiled at her like a woman who had already won. The veil was not for mourning, it was for hiding. And Orabel had been hiding for 3 years. But today, something was different. A letter had arrived, sealed in black wax, stamped with a crest so powerful that even the butler's hands had trembled when he carried it in. The Duke of Ashimore had requested her presence. Not her stepsister. Not her stepmother. Her. Drusilla had read it first, naturally. She always did. And the look that crossed her face, that brief flash of fear, poorly disguised as contempt, told Orabel everything she needed to know. Whatever the Duke wanted, her stepmother did not want her to have it. And that, more than anything, made Orabel fold the letter carefully, press it against her chest, and lift her chin beneath her veil for the first time in 3 years. Now, before we go further into this story, tell me something. If your own family was your greatest enemy, would you still fight for your happiness? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. And if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit the subscribe button right now. We are just getting started. Orabel did not sleep the night before she was summoned to Ashimore House. She sat at the edge of her narrow bed, the Duke's letter open across her knees, reading it for the 11th time by candlelight. The words had not changed. They never would. But something about seeing them again, feeling the weight of that thick parchment between her fingers, made her heart do something it had not done in a very long time. It hoped. She pressed her hand flat against her chest as if she could physically stop it. Hope was dangerous. Hope was the thing Countess Drusilla had spent 3 years systematically destroying inside her, one cruel word at a time, one locked door at a time, one veil at a time. The veil had started as a punishment. 3 years ago, 2 weeks after her father's funeral, Drusilla had called Orabel into the sitting room, where the curtains were always drawn, and the air smelled of cold roses and something bitter underneath. Orabel had been 18 then, still soft with grief, still believing that the woman her father had loved deserved at least the benefit of her doubt. She remembered standing in that room while Drusilla walked circles around her, studying her the way a merchant studies a bolt of cloth before deciding it is not worth the price. "Your face," Drusilla had said finally, stopping directly in front of her, "is a problem." Orabel had not understood at first. She had touched her cheek without thinking. "Not because it is ugly," Drusilla continued, and something about the way she said it made the word ugly feel like it was being nailed into the wall, but because it is exactly the kind of face that makes men look twice, and men who look at you will not look at my Florette. Florette was Drusilla's daughter from her first marriage. 19 years old, pale and pretty in a delicate way, and utterly convinced that every room she entered had been waiting for her arrival. "You will wear a veil," Drusilla said. "In public, in private, at every gathering, at every meal where guests are present. You will say your face was damaged in a riding accident. You will say nothing else. I will not, Orabel had replied. Those 3 words cost her more than she expected. Drusilla had smiled, not with warmth, with patience, the patience of a woman who had already thought several steps ahead. Your father left his estate in my hands until you marry, she said. Every coin, every deed, every servant's wage. If you refuse me, I will dismiss your father's housekeeper, Mrs. Potton, who has served this family for 30 years. I will sell your mother's writing desk. I will send your father's old horse, Bramble, to the knacker before the week is out. Orabel had gone very still. Or, Drusilla said, tilting her head gently, you wear the veil, and everything stays exactly as it is. So Orabel had worn the veil. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself that a woman without legal access to her own inheritance had very few weapons available, and patience was the sharpest one. But 3 years had passed, and she was still wearing it. And somewhere along the way, the veil had stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like a second skin. Or she had almost forgotten what it felt like to let people see her face without a layer of fine cloth between them. Almost. She folded the Duke's letter carefully now, tucking it inside the small wooden box where she kept the only things Drusilla had never found. Her mother's locket, a pressed violet from her father's garden. And now this. A letter from the Duke of Ashenmore, written in a firm and unhurried hand, requesting that Miss Orabel Thorne attend him at Ashenmore House on the morning of the 14th at 10 o'clock, regarding a matter of considerable importance to them both. Regarding a matter of considerable importance to them both. She had read that line more than any other. What importance could she possibly hold for a man like the Duke of Ashenmore? She had never met him. No, she had never been formally introduced to anyone of his standing, because Drusilla made certain that Orabel was conveniently indisposed whenever society called. She knew his name, of course. Everyone in the county knew his name. Duke Callum Drave of Ashenmore. 31 years old. Unmarried. The kind of man that mothers whispered about with longing and fathers discussed with a mixture of envy and discomfort. He had inherited one of the oldest titles in England at 23 after his own father's sudden death. He had rebuilt the Ashenmore estate from what gossip described as near financial ruin into something formidable and unshakable. He was said to be cold in manner, precise in speech, and absolutely without interest in the marriage market, which only made every family with a daughter more determined to change his mind. Well, Drusilla's face, when she read his letter, had told Orabel something important. Her stepmother was not confused by it. She was afraid of it. And Drusilla was not a woman who frightened easily. The candle burned low. Orabel finally lay down on top of her covers, still dressed, the wooden box held against her ribs, and waited for morning. She did not sleep at all. By 8:30 the next morning, the house was already in a particular kind of chaos that Drusilla orchestrated rather than suffered. Orabel could hear it from her room. Florette's voice, high and petulant, demanded that her hair be redone because the first arrangement made her look like a country person's wife. The lady's maid, Tess, apologizes in rapid, breathless bursts. The older housemaid, Dotty, shuffled past Orabel's door with a stack of pressed linens, Sir pausing just long enough to whisper through the keyhole that the Countess had ordered the carriage brought round for all three of them. All three of them. Orabel opened her door. "Dotty." The old woman turned, her kind eyes full of something between warning and sympathy. "She means to bring you along, Miss Orabel. Says it would look strange otherwise, you being absent when the letter was addressed to you directly. She means to control what I say when I get there." Dotty glanced down the hall and said nothing, which was the answer enough. Orabel dressed herself, as she always did, because Drusilla had reallocated her personal maid to Florette 18 months ago. She chose her neatest gown and pinned her dark hair firmly at the back of her neck. She placed the veil over her face and settled it carefully, and then she looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman looking back at her was obscured, softened, made into something less specific, less present, less real. That was the point. She picked up the Duke's letter, tucked it into her coat, and walked out of her room to meet whatever was coming. Ashenmore House was nothing like Orabel had expected. She had imagined something cold, the way people described the Duke himself, stone walls and iron gates, and a stillness that felt like it was warning visitors away. But the house that appeared at the end of the long gravel drive was wide and warm-windowed, the old stone softened by climbing greenery, the entrance flanked by two enormous oak trees whose roots had been there longer than any living memory. It was the kind of house that had endured, quietly, firmly, without apology. Drusilla sat across from Orabel in the carriage, wearing the expression of a general reviewing a battlefield. Florette sat beside her mother, fidgeting with her gloves, cheeks flushed with excitement that she was trying very hard to disguise as boredom. "You will speak only when spoken to directly," Drusilla said, her eyes fixed on Orabel. "You will not mention the letter. You will not contradict anything I say. And you will smile if the veil permits anyone to notice." "The letter was addressed to me," Orabel said. "The letter," Drusilla replied smoothly, "was clearly a matter of administrative confusion. A man like the Duke of Ashenmore has no conceivable business with you. It was meant for Florette. Anyone with sense would understand that." Florette glanced sideways at Orabel and then quickly away. There were moments, rare and brief, when Orabel thought she saw something uncomfortable flicker across her stepsister's face. Not guilt exactly. Something younger than guilt. Something that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. The carriage stopped. A footman in Ashenmore livery opened the door with practiced efficiency. Drusilla descended first, adjusting her posture as she went, assembling herself into the woman she performed for public consumption. Florette followed, bright-eyed, chin lifted, already scanning the entrance for someone worth impressing. Orabel stepped down last and stood on the gravel drive with the morning wind pressing lightly against her veil. The butler who met them at the door was a tall, composed man named Mr. Graves. He had the kind of face that revealed absolutely nothing, which Orabel suspected was a skill that took decades to perfect. He looked at the three of them, checked his small leather book and said, "Miss Orabel Thorne." Just that. No one else. Drusilla's smile did not waver. "We are all together, of course. Lady Drusilla, or Countess of Threnwick, and Miss Florette. Miss Orabel's family." "Of course, my lady," Mr. Graves said with a small bow. However, His Grace specified Miss Orabel Thorne alone. if the Countess and Miss Florette would be so kind as to wait in the east parlour. Refreshments will be brought immediately. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Orabel watched something move through Drusilla's expression like weather crossing open ground. Surprise, then fury, then the controlled settling of fury back into composure. It was remarkable to watch, the discipline it required. "Of course," Drusilla said, pleasantly, dangerously. Mr. Graves led Orabel through a series of well-proportioned corridors, past portraits in heavy frames and side tables bearing small arrangements of hothouse flowers. But the house smelled of beeswax and old books, and something that might have been wood smoke from an earlier fire. Everything about it suggested order without stiffness, care without excess. They stopped before a set of tall double doors. Mr. Graves knocked once, received some acknowledgement from within that Orabel could not quite hear, and opened the doors. "Miss Orabel Thorne, Your Grace." She walked in. The study was large and lined with bookshelves on 2 walls. Maps were pinned to a board near the window. A fire had been laid but not recently lit, the hearth cold and clean. And behind the large central desk sat Duke Callum Drave of Ashenmore, who was not at all what 3 years of county gossip had prepared her for. He was younger looking than she had expected, or perhaps it was simply that his face was more expressive than the word cold suggested. He had dark eyes that moved to her the moment she entered, and did not leave. His desk was covered in papers and ledgers, all arranged with the precision of a man who knew exactly where everything was and why. He stood as she entered, which surprised her. She had not expected that courtesy. "Miss Thorne," he said. His voice was low and even. "Thank you for coming." "You gave me little reason to refuse, Your Grace," she said, and then immediately wondered if that was too direct an opening. But something shifted at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across the desk. He waited until she had settled before returning to his own seat, which told her something about him. And she was not sure yet what exactly, but something. There was a third person in the room. Orabel noticed her now, standing near the bookshelf to the left, a woman of perhaps 50, with sharp grey eyes and a posture that suggested military precision. She was introduced as Mrs. Alderton, the Duke's senior estate manager, and her presence struck Orabel as deliberate rather than incidental. A witness, perhaps, or a chaperone of sorts, or simply a woman the Duke trusted. "I will be direct with you, Miss Thorne," the Duke said, folding his hands on the desk. "I have been aware of your situation for some time. I am aware of the terms your stepmother imposed following your father's death. I am aware of the veil, and I am aware of the reason for it." Orabel's hands, resting in her lap, went very still. "I am also aware," he continued, his voice not unkind, "that you have managed your circumstances with a composure that a great many people would not have sustained. I do not say that to flatter you. I say it because it is relevant to the proposal I am about to make." "Proposal," she repeated carefully. "I need a wife," the Duke said, plainly, without decoration. "Not a love match, not a social arrangement. I need a woman of intelligence and steadiness, someone who can manage a household, represent this estate, and hold a conversation that does not begin and end with the season's gossip. I have conducted a quiet search for the better part of a year. Your name was brought to my attention by your father's former solicitor. Mr. Grenby, who described you as the most capable woman your father had ever known, and the most cheated one. Orabel felt something behind her eyes that she refused to allow further forward. Mr. Grenby, she said quietly. He came to me, Miss Thorne. I did not seek him. He felt you had been wronged, and that someone with the means to correct it ought to know. The Duke looked at her steadily. I am offering you a contract of marriage. You would have full legal standing as my Duchess. Your father's estate would pass to you immediately upon our union, as the terms of his will specified your inheritance upon your marriage to a man of sufficient standing. You would have financial independence, social protection, and the freedom to live as you see fit within the bounds of what we agree. The fire that was not lit could not account for the warmth spreading through Orabel's chest. And what, she said, keeping her voice level, would you require from me? Precisely what I said. Intelligence, steadiness, honesty. He paused, and the removal of that veil, not for my sake, but because I will not have my Duchess hiding her face in her own home. The room was very quiet. Orabel looked at him across the wide desk. This man she had never met before today. This stranger who had known more about her life than most people she had spoken to in 3 years. And she thought about Drusilla sitting in the east parlour right now, drinking Ashenmore tea, calculating furiously, and understanding for the first time that she had miscalculated somewhere. "Oh, I have one condition," Orabel said. The Duke raised an eyebrow slightly. Mrs. Alderton, near the bookshelf, did not move. "Mrs. Potton," Orabel said. "My father's housekeeper. She is still in the Threnwick household. She stays employed and is treated well, or I walk out of this room and we never speak of this again." The Duke was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "Done." Orabel Thorne straightened in her chair, reached up to the edge of her veil, and for the first time in 3 years, lifted it from her face. She did not look away from him when she did it. He did not look away from her either. The carriage ride back to Threnwick House was the longest Orabel had ever endured. Drusilla said nothing for the first 10 minutes. That was the most frightening part. Drusilla silent was far more dangerous than Drusilla speaking. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing countryside, her jaw set in a way that made the muscles in her neck look like rope pulled too tight. Florette kept glancing between her mother and Orabel with the nervous energy of someone sitting between two people who might strike lightning at any moment. Orabel sat with her hand steady in her lap and her veil back in place and said nothing at all. She had replaced the veil before leaving the Duke's study, not because she was ashamed, not because she had surrendered anything, but because she understood strategy now in a way that 3 years under Drusilla's roof had quietly, painfully taught her. The Duke knew her face. That was what mattered. Drusilla did not need to know what had changed until Orabel was ready for her to know. Mr. Graves had shown her out through a side corridor, while Drusilla and Florette were still being escorted from the east parlour. She had stepped back into the carriage before either of them reached it, which meant she had been seated and composed when they arrived, flushed and unsettled, at the carriage door. Drusilla had looked at her very hard before climbing in. Now, 10 minutes into the ride, the silence broke. "What did he say to you?" Drusilla said. Not a question, a demand wearing a question's clothing. "He spoke about the county's agricultural arrangements," Orabel said. He had some questions regarding the east fields that border Threnwick land, my father's old boundary agreements. Drusilla stared at her. That is all. That is all, my lady. Another silence. Florette exhaled very quietly, the way people do when tension drops 1 degree below unbearable. He is an odd man, Drusilla said finally. Summoning a girl in a veil to discuss boundary agreements, it makes no sense. Men of great power often operate in ways that do not require our understanding, Orabel said, which was the kind of agreeable, slightly deferential thing she had learned to say when she needed Drusilla to feel that she had won something. Drusilla settled back against the carriage seat, not entirely convinced, but unwilling to press further without more information to press with. Orabel looked out the window and thought about 3 seconds. The 3 seconds the Duke had taken before agreeing to her condition regarding Mrs. Potton. She had been watching him carefully in those 3 seconds, and what she saw was not a man calculating cost. It was a man who was mildly surprised to be impressed. She thought about Mrs. Alderton, standing near the bookshelf, who had given her the smallest nod as she left the room. Almost imperceptible. The kind of nod that meant something, though Orabel was not yet sure what. She thought about Mr. Grenby, her father's old solicitor, who had apparently walked into the Duke of Ashenmore's life and laid out her circumstances like a case before a judge. She had not seen Mr. Grenby since the month after her father's funeral, when Drusilla had replaced him with her own legal man, a thin-mouthed fellow named Satterley, who did exactly as he was told, and never once looked Orabel in the eye. Mr. Grenby had remembered her. He had done something about it. She pressed her fingers briefly against the letter, still tucked inside her coat, and allowed herself, carefully, quietly, to feel something that was not quite hope yet. It was the thing that came just before hope. The moment when the door you thought was sealed forever shows the thinnest line of light at its edge. They arrived home. Drusilla swept inside with Florette close behind. Orabel followed at a measured distance and went directly to her room, where she found old Dotty waiting with a cup of tea and an expression that asked everything without saying a word. Not yet, Orabel told her softly. Dotty nodded, set down the tea, and left without a sound. Orabel sat at her small writing desk, drew out a fresh sheet of paper, and began composing a very careful letter to Mr. Grenby. She had 3 days before she was due to give the Duke her answer in writing. She intended to use every hour of those 3 days wisely. What she did not account for was Florette. Just past 9 that evening, a soft knock came at Orabel's door. Not the hesitant knock of a servant. Something less certain. She opened it to find Florette standing in the corridor in her evening wrap, hair already down for bed, holding a small lamp and looking, for once, entirely unlike the person her mother had trained her to be. "May I come in?" Florette said. Also not quite a question. Orabel stepped back and let her enter. Florette sat on the edge of the chair near the window, set her lamp on the sill, and looked at her hands for a long moment. "He asked for you specifically," she said. "Not me. He didn't even know my name." "No," Orabel agreed. "Mother told me this morning that the Duke was likely interested in making an introduction. She spent an hour telling me how to hold a teacup in a way that looks effortless." A short, strange sound escaped Florette that might have been a laugh or something adjacent to it. "I practiced holding a teacup for an hour." Orabel said nothing. She had learned that silence, used correctly, invited people to say the things they actually came to say. Florette looked up. Her eyes were their mother's shape, but held something her mother's eyes had long since lost. "Is he going to offer for you?" The question landed cleanly in the quiet room. "Would that trouble you?" Orabelle asked. De Florette was quiet for a moment that felt genuinely difficult for her. "Mother will be furious," she said finally. "Not because she wanted me to marry him specifically, because she wanted to be the one to arrange it. Because if you marry well without her help, then everything she tells everyone about why you wear the veil, about why you never attend gatherings, all of it unravels." She paused. "And because your father's estate goes with you when you go." There it was. "Go to bed, Florette," Orabelle said, not unkindly. Florette stood, picked up her lamp, and moved to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "For what it is worth," she said, not turning around, "I never thought you were ugly. I just never said so." She left. Orabelle stood in her room for a long time after that, looking at the closed door, or thinking about the cost of never saying things and how quietly that cost accumulated over years. Then she sat back down and finished her letter to Mr. Grenby. The response from Mr. Grenby arrived in less than 2 days. Orabelle had sent her letter through Dottie, who had a nephew who worked at the village post and owed her more favors than either of them bothered to count. Drusilla monitored the household correspondence as a matter of habit, but she had never thought to monitor Dottie, which was one of several things Drusilla had underestimated over the years. Mr. Grenby's reply was brief, precise, and written in the tidy hand of a man who had spent 40 years choosing his words with the care of someone who understood their legal weight. He confirmed that he had indeed approached the Duke of Ashenmore on Orabelle's behalf. He confirmed that the terms of her father's will were exactly as the Duke had described. He added one piece of information the Duke had not mentioned. While the window for claiming her inheritance was not indefinite, if Orabelle did not marry before her 22nd birthday, the estate would pass entirely and irrevocably into Drusilla's control. That was the clause her stepmother's legal man, Satterley, had buried in the renegotiated documents 2 years ago, which Mr. Grenby had only recently uncovered when a former colleague brought it to his attention. Orabelle's 22nd birthday was 11 weeks away. She read that line 3 times. Then she set the letter down on her writing desk, pressed both palms flat against the wood, and took a slow and deliberate breath. 11 weeks. She thought about Drusilla, somewhere downstairs right now, entirely unaware that her carefully constructed timeline had just been seen and named. There was something almost clarifying about it, that the threat was no longer shapeless. It had a number attached to it. 11 weeks. That was something she could work with. She wrote her reply to the Duke that same afternoon. Brief, clear, and without ornamentation. She accepted. Dottie carried it out again through the same quiet channel. By evening, a note arrived from Ashenmore House, again addressed to Orabelle alone, confirming receipt and stating that the Duke's own solicitor, a man named Mr. Farwell, would call at Threnwick House the following morning to begin the formal arrangements, and that the Duke would be present in person. In person. Orabelle sat with that for a moment. Then she began to think very carefully about what Drusilla would do when a duke and his solicitor appeared at her door the next morning, without warning, or she decided to give her stepmother no warning whatsoever. Morning arrived with the particular crispness of a late autumn day, the kind that made everything feel sharp-edged and serious. Orabel was dressed and downstairs before anyone else in the household was properly awake. She had spoken to Mr. Graves, Ashenmore's butler, through an intermediary note the previous evening, asking that the Duke's party arrive at precisely 9:30, which was early enough that Drusilla would be caught still assembling herself for the day. The knock at the front door came at 9:30 exactly. Henderson, the Threnwick butler, a loyal and long-suffering man who had served the household since before Drusilla arrived, and privately despised everything she had done to it, answered the door with Orabel standing 3 steps behind him in the entrance hall. Duke Callum Drave of Ashenmore stood on the front step. He was taller than she had fully registered in his study, or perhaps it was simply that a man like him filled outdoor space differently than indoor. He was dressed plainly for a duke, well cut and precise, but without the decorative excess that some men of his rank seemed to require. Beside him stood Mr. Farwell, a compact and serious-faced man carrying a leather case. Behind them both stood another figure, a broad-shouldered man of about 40, with watchful eyes, and a posture that suggested he handled whatever needed handling. The Duke's personal secretary, she would later learn. His name was Mr. Croft. The Duke looked at Orabel, then at the veil. Something crossed his face, not judgment, or something more like a question he had decided not to ask yet. "Miss Thorne," he said. "Your Grace," she replied. "Please come in. Shall I have tea brought to the drawing room?" "That would be fine," he said, and walked in as if the house had been expecting him for years. Henderson, bless the man, did not so much as blink. They were barely settled in the drawing room when the sound of rapid footsteps on the staircase announced Drusilla's arrival. She appeared in the doorway, wearing an expression of controlled shock that had taken approximately 90 seconds to compose itself into something resembling welcome. She had clearly dressed in a hurry. Her hair was not quite what it would have been given another 20 minutes. "Your Grace," she said, now moving into the room with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent her life performing in front of audiences. "What an unexpected and wonderful honor. I wish we had known you were coming. We would have prepared something far more suitable." "The visit is suitable as it is," the Duke said pleasantly. He did not stand when she entered. That was not an accident. Drusilla's eyes moved rapidly around the room, cataloguing everything. The solicitor, the leather case, Orabel sitting quietly in the chair closest to the Duke, the absence of any confusion or surprise on Orabel's face. She was understanding, in real time, that she had been outmaneuvered. Orabel could see the moment it landed. "I have come to formally notify the household," the Duke said, settling back slightly in his chair with the ease of a man entirely comfortable occupying any room he entered, "that I am seeking Miss Orabel Thorne's hand in marriage. Mr. Farwell has the relevant documentation. We would like to proceed with the arrangements efficiently, given the timeline involved." The silence in the drawing room was extraordinary. Florette appeared in the doorway behind her mother, still pulling on her gloves, and stopped dead. Drusilla turned to look at Orabel with an expression that was trying very hard to be gracious and was not fully succeeding. "Orabel, dear," she said, with a softness in her voice that was entirely constructed. "This is all rather sudden. Surely you and I should discuss this privately before any formal proceedings." "There is nothing to discuss," Orabel said, quietly, firmly. "What, I have accepted His Grace's proposal. Mr. Farwell has my signed agreement." Drusilla looked at Mr. Farwell and the leather case with something approaching hatred. "My lady," Mr. Farwell said, opening the case with efficient movements, "per the terms of the late Earl of Threnwick's original will, Miss Orabel Thorne's inheritance transfers to her upon marriage to a gentleman of standing. His Grace the Duke of Ashenmore clearly meets that qualification. We will also be addressing the amendment to the estate documentation that was filed approximately 2 years ago, which Mr. Grenby has flagged as procedurally irregular." The word irregular landed in the room like a stone into still water. Drusilla went very still. "Procedurally irregular," she repeated. "Yes, my lady. His Grace has engaged in a legal review. It should be resolved well before the wedding." Orabel watched her stepmother in that moment and felt something she had not expected. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter. The particular feeling of a long-held breath finally, carefully, released. Drusilla turned to her one more time, and in that turning, something in her face shifted. The performance faltered, just for a second, just long enough for Orabel to see underneath it, not the calculating woman who had built a cage around her for 3 years, but something older than that, something cornered, something that had perhaps always been afraid of exactly this. Then it was gone. The composure returned. Drusilla sat down, folded her hands, and said, "Well then, I suppose congratulations are in order." Nobody in the room believed her, but nobody needed to. Across the low table, the Duke looked at Orabel with those steady, dark eyes and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. There was a conversation happening in the silence between them that had nothing to do with inheritance documents or procedural irregularities. It had to do with the fact that Orabel had lifted her veil in his study 2 days ago, and he had looked at her face without flinching, without performing surprise, without saying a single foolish thing about how she had nothing to hide. He had simply looked. The way you look at something you find genuinely worth looking at. And she looked back. In the doorway, Florette stood very quietly with her gloves half on, watching the room with those eyes that had not yet decided what they wanted to be. Then she stepped fully inside, took a seat near the window and folded her hands in her lap. But outside, the autumn morning continued its sharp and serious business. The trees along the Threnwick Drive shed their leaves in slow, deliberate falls. Inside, something was ending, and something else, quieter and more durable, was only just beginning. The wedding was set for 6 weeks from the morning the Duke walked into Threnwick House and changed everything. 6 weeks was not long. In London society, engagements of less than 6 months were considered rushed at best and scandalous at worst. But the Duke of Ashenmore had never particularly concerned himself with what society considered appropriate, and Orabel had 11 weeks before her birthday, and every reason to move quickly. Mr. Farwell worked with a speed and thoroughness that suggested he had been preparing for this moment longer than the engagement itself. The legal review of the amended estate documents moved forward with quiet efficiency. Within 4 days of the drawing-room meeting, Mr. Grenby had submitted a formal challenge to the amendment Satterley had buried 2 years ago, and supported by 3 witnesses from the original signing, who confirmed that the Earl of Threnwick had never authorized that particular clause. Satterley, when contacted, produced paperwork that Mr. Farwell described as questionable in origin. Within a week, the matter had been escalated to a county magistrate, a friend of the Duke's named Sir Rowan Petch, who had the kind of unhurried authority that made proceedings move very quickly when he wanted them to. Drusilla hired a new solicitor, then another. Neither of them found firm ground to stand on. She was not finished, of course. A woman like Drusilla did not accept loss quietly. She accepted it the way a river accepts a dam, by finding every crack and pressing into it with steady, patient force. Her first attempt was social. She began calling on the county's most influential households, of the Merrywell family at Duncastle, the elderly Lady Forthcut, who controlled more of the local social calendar than anyone acknowledged openly, the Barrow Finch sisters, who had opinions about everything and shared them constantly. Drusilla told a story. In her version, Orabel was fragile, impressionable, a girl who had been sheltered perhaps too long and was now being rushed into a significant commitment by a powerful man before she fully understood the consequences. She never said anything that could be directly quoted against her. She never had to. The Duke's response was swift and entirely unexpected. He called on Lady Forthcut himself, personally, on a Tuesday afternoon, which was when the old woman received visitors, and he sat with her for 40 minutes, drinking tea and talking about her late husband's collection of navigational maps, about which he knew a remarkable amount. He left her thoroughly charmed and modestly astonished. By Wednesday morning, Lady Forthcut had mentioned to no fewer than 6 people that the Duke of Ashenmore was a man of uncommon sense, and that his choice of bride spoke well of his judgment. The Merrywell family received an invitation to a small dinner at Ashenmore House that same week. The Barrow Finch sisters were included. So was Sir Rowan Petch and his wife, a warm and forthright woman named Mrs. Petch, who had known Orabel's father years ago, and cried a little when she learned who Orabel was. Orabel attended that dinner. It was the first formal social gathering she had attended in 3 years, though she dressed carefully, with Dottie's help, because she had requested that Dottie be formally transferred to her service as part of the household arrangements, and Dottie had agreed with a ferocity of gratitude that made the old woman pretend to have something in her eye. She did not wear the veil. Walking into the Ashenmore dining room without it was the strangest sensation she had experienced in recent memory. She was aware of her own face in a way she had not been in years, the feeling of air against her cheeks, the absence of that fine gauze between herself and the world. She kept her chin level and her shoulders back, and reminded herself firmly that she had done nothing wrong and had nothing to conceal. Mrs. Petch saw her first and came directly across the room. "My dear girl," she said, taking both of Orabel's hands. "Did you look exactly like your mother? She was a wonderful woman. Your father spoke of her until his last day." She squeezed Orabel's hands hard and then composed herself. "You are going to be magnificent." The Duke appeared at Orabel's side a moment later, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been watching the room and chose his moment deliberately. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that his presence was a kind of statement. "Miss Thorne," he said, "may I introduce Mr. and Mrs. Barrow Finch?" The evening moved forward. Orabel talked. She listened. She asked questions that people found interesting, and gave answers that people found more interesting still. She had spent 3 years reading every book she could find, and thinking about everything she read. which turned out to be excellent preparation for dinner conversation with people who expected nothing much from a girl in a veil. She caught the Duke watching her twice during the meal. Both times when their eyes met, he looked away first. Not quickly, deliberately, the way you look away from something when you are trying to be fair about it. She thought about that on the carriage ride home, with Dottie dozing in the corner and the night countryside dark outside the window. She thought about it more than she intended to. The second of Drusilla's attempts was more direct and came from a direction Orabelle had not fully anticipated. Florette came to her room again, 10 days before the wedding. This time she did not knock softly. She opened the door with the energy of someone who had been arguing with herself all the way down the corridor and had finally won. "Mother is planning something," Florette said, closing the door behind her. "I don't know exactly what. But she has been writing letters and burning them, which she only does when she's planning something she doesn't want traced." Orabelle set down her book. "How many letters?" "At least 4 that I have seen. And she met with a man yesterday in the back garden, which was strange because she never uses the back garden. I saw them from my window. I didn't recognize him. What did he look like? Thin, dark coat. He carried a satchel and he didn't look like a solicitor. Solicitors look uncomfortable. This man looked comfortable, which was worse somehow." Orabelle thought for a moment. "Did you tell her you saw?" "No." Florette sat down on the edge of the chair in the same spot she had occupied the first night she came. "Orabelle." She stopped, tried again. "I know I haven't been what I should have been to you. I know I let her do things I should have spoken against. I was afraid of her, and I told myself that was reason enough." She looked up. "It wasn't?" The room was quiet. "No," Orabelle said gently. "It wasn't." "I'm telling you now," Florette said. "That's what I can do now. I'm telling you now." Orabelle looked at her stepsister for a long moment. Florette was not her enemy. She had never been her enemy. She had simply been a younger, less armored person, living in the same difficult house, making the smaller and more frightened choices. That was not the same thing as malice. "Thank you," Orabelle said. Truly." She sent word to Mr. Croft at Ashenmore House that evening, the Duke's broad-shouldered and watchful secretary, who she was beginning to understand was the man who handled precisely this kind of thing. She described the stranger in the back garden. She described the burned letters. Mr. Croft, it turned out, already knew about the man. His name was Tilby. He was a former clerk with a flexible relationship with the truth and a history of producing documents at convenient moments for people who could afford to commission them. He had worked with Satterley twice before on unrelated matters, both of which had involved paperwork that was later quietly disputed. The Duke moved on this with the efficiency of someone who had not built a significant estate by waiting for problems to arrive fully formed at his door. Tilby was located, and interviewed at length by Sir Rowan Petch's office, and quietly encouraged to remove himself from the county before the week was out. He went without significant protest, which suggested the encouragement had been persuasive. Whatever Drusilla had planned, it dissolved before it took shape. She appeared at breakfast the following morning, looking like a woman who had slept poorly and thought heavily, and arrived at some internal reckoning that she was keeping entirely to herself. She said nothing unusual. She ate her toast. She poured her tea. Orabelle watched her and felt again that complicated quiet feeling. Not forgiveness exactly. something that was thinking about the direction of forgiveness without having arrived there yet. 5 days before the wedding, Mrs. Potton arrived at Ashenmore House. She had been brought from Threnwick as part of the agreed terms, as the Duke had promised, and she was given a senior position in the Ashenmore household that suited her experience and her dignity. When Orabel saw her in the Ashenmore entrance hall, the old housekeeper looked at her the way people look at someone they had quietly feared they might never see properly again. "Miss Orabel," Mrs. Potton said, and her voice broke just slightly on the second word. "Mrs. Potton," Orabel said, and hugged her, which was not particularly formal, but was entirely necessary. The Duke, passing through the entrance hall at that moment, with Mr. Croft and a stack of documents, paused long enough to observe this. Then he continued on his way without comment, what which Orabel was beginning to recognize as his particular way of acknowledging things he found good. That evening, he found her in the library. She had been exploring it methodically since her first visit to the house. It was a serious library, built by someone who actually read rather than someone who wanted to appear to, and it gave her a specific kind of happiness that she had almost forgotten was available to her. He came in quietly, which she was also beginning to recognize as characteristic. He moved through spaces without announcing himself, not because he was secretive, but because he was comfortable. "You found the geography section," he said, looking at the book open in her hands. "It's extraordinary," she said. "Your father's?" "My grandfather's, mostly." My father added the botanical volumes. He sat in the chair across from hers, which was the same configuration as in his study, and she wondered if that was deliberate. My father was not well suited to running an estate. He was better suited to looking at pictures of plants in faraway places. "That sounds peaceful," she said. "It sounds expensive," he replied, and there was something dry and fond in it at the same time. They sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The fire was lit this time, the hearth warm and generous. "You did not have to manage Tilby yourself," she said after a while. "You could have told me and let me handle it." "You were managing Drusilla," he said. "I managed Tilby. It seemed efficient." "You mean you didn't want me to worry?" A brief pause. "I mean, it seemed efficient." She looked at him over her book. He looked back with those steady, dark eyes. "Callum," she said, testing the use of his name for the first time, which was bold, and she knew it. Something in his expression shifted. It was small, and she might have missed it in worse lighting. "Orabel," he said back, and the way he said it made her name feel like something he had been thinking about for longer than the conversation. She looked back at her book. He stayed in his chair. The fire moved warmly through the room. She did not read a single word of the page in front of her for the next 20 minutes, and strongly suspected that he knew it. The morning of the wedding arrived cold and brilliant. The sky above Ashenmore a hard and perfect white that made everything beneath it look deliberate and significant. Orabel sat at the dressing table in the guest chamber that had been prepared for her at the house, Dottie moving behind her with careful hands, pinning and arranging with the focused tenderness of a woman who had waited a long time for a morning like this one. The gown was simple. That had been Orabel's choice. She had refused the elaborate confections that the county's most recommended modiste had initially presented, with their layers and their excessive construction, and had instead described exactly what she wanted. Something clean, something that moved well, something that felt like herself. the modiste, a forthright woman named Madame Lecroix, who had strong opinions about fashion and stronger opinions about women who knew their own minds, had looked at her for a long moment and then said, finally, a woman who knows what she wants to wear. And she had produced something that was exactly right. Dotty fastened the last pin and stood back. Orabelle looked at herself in the mirror. She had not worn a veil since the dinner at Ashenmore House 3 weeks ago. The absence of it had felt strange for the first few days, and then simply felt like reality restoring itself, like a window that had been papered over and was finally clear again. The woman in the mirror looked back at her directly. Dark hair pinned with small white flowers that Dotty had cut fresh from the Ashenmore greenhouse that morning, and dark eyes that had seen considerable difficulty and had not gone dull from it. A face that had spent 3 years behind cloth and had emerged from it unchanged, because the things that had been worth seeing had always been there, patient and intact. Your mother would weep, Dotty said softly. With happiness, mind you. Only with happiness. Orabelle reached back and pressed the old woman's hand briefly. Then she stood. There was a knock at the chamber door. Unexpected. She opened it to find Florette standing in the corridor, dressed for the ceremony, hands clasped in front of her. Mother isn't coming, Florette said. She decided this morning that she had a headache. I know, Orabelle said. Florette blinked. You know? Henderson told Dotty an hour ago. I suspected she would find a reason, and it is easier for her not to watch. Florette absorbed this. Are you angry? Orabelle considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. No, she said at last. I think I might have been, a year ago, but I've run out of anger for her. It took too much to carry. Florette was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I brought you something. She held out a small object, a hair comb, old ivory, with a pattern of tiny flowers worked into the edge. It was my grandmother's, my real grandmother, my father's mother, not hers. She left it to me, and I never wore it, because it never felt like the right occasion. She paused. This is the right occasion. Orabelle took the comb carefully. She turned it over in her fingers. Then she held it out to Dotty, who understood immediately and worked it into the arrangement at the back of Orabelle's hair with quiet skill. Thank you, Orabelle told Florette. Florette straightened slightly. You're welcome, she said, with the careful dignity of someone practicing at something they intended to get better at. They walked to the church together. The church at Ashenmore was old, older than the house, its stone walls thick and its interior lit by high windows that threw long angled light across the pews in the cold morning. It was not a large ceremony. The Duke had been explicit about that, and Orabelle had agreed without hesitation. The people present were the people who meant something. Mrs. Petch sat in the front pew beside her husband, already misty-eyed. Mr. Grenby had come, grey-haired and upright, or sitting with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done the right thing and lived to see it land properly. Mrs. Alderton, the Duke's estate manager, occupied a pew near the middle with the posture of someone attending a proceeding she had expected to arrive at eventually. Mr. Croft stood near the back, watchful as always. Henderson had come from Threnwick, given the morning off by his own decision, because some occasions required attendance, regardless of instruction. Madame Lecroix had not been invited, but had appeared anyway, and nobody had asked her to leave. The Barrow Finch sisters occupied a pew together and were already whispering to each other, which was simply what they did in every location. And there, in a pew by herself near the left window, sat Lady Forthcut, who had apparently decided that this was an occasion worth leaving her house for, which she rarely did for anything. She caught Orabelle's eye as she walked in, and gave a small nod that managed to convey both approval and a certain satisfaction at her own judgment. The Duke stood at the front of the church. Orabelle saw him the moment she entered, and she did not look away. He was dressed without excess, precise, and dark, entirely himself. He was watching the door with the focused attention of a man who had learned that the things worth waiting for were worth watching for carefully. When he saw her, something in his face did the small, controlled shift she had been learning to read. It was not an expression that performed itself for the room. It was an expression that happened because it could not help it. She walked toward him. There was no one to give her away. Her father was gone. She had considered asking Mr. Grenby and had ultimately decided against it. She did not need to be given. She was arriving of her own volition, under her own power, in her own name. That was the point of everything that had led here. She reached him. He looked at her face with the same directness he had on the first day she lifted the veil, and she thought, not for the first time, that it was a particular and underrated quality in a person to look at someone and simply see them, not what they represented, not what they could provide, not the shape of a category or the answer to a question, just them. "You came," he said quietly, while the vicar arranged his papers. "I said I would," she replied. "You did," he agreed. And there it was again, with that not-quite smile that was more honest than most people's full ones. The ceremony was not long. The vicar, a gentleman named Mr. Osby, who had christened the Duke as an infant and seemed quietly moved to be marrying him, spoke the words with warmth and no unnecessary elaboration. The responses were clear. The ring was plain and well made. When it was done, the small congregation released a collective breath that sounded very much like relief, which Orabelle found rather touching. Outside the church, in the cold, brilliant morning, people gathered on the stone path with the cheerful disorganization of a small group who were genuinely pleased. Mrs. Petch embraced Orabelle immediately and thoroughly. Mr. Grenby shook her hand with both of his and said simply, "Well done, my dear. Well done." Madame Lacroix examined the gown with professional satisfaction and said it had survived the ceremony beautifully, which was her version of congratulations. The Barrowfinch sisters descended on the Duke with questions that he fielded with patient brevity. Florette stood at the edge of the gathering, slightly apart, watching everything with those undecided eyes. Orabelle crossed to her. "Come and have some tea," she said. "You are not on the edge of this. You are in it." Florette looked at her with something that was still learning to be grateful. She came. The wedding breakfast at Ashenmore House was warm and generous and loud in the good way that small gatherings become when people genuinely like each other. Mrs. Potton had overseen the arrangements with the authority of a woman back in her proper element, and the table was abundant. Mr. Croft made a toast that was brief and unexpectedly touching. Lady Forthcut drank 2 glasses of wine and told a story about meeting the Duke's grandfather that made everyone laugh. Through all of it, Orabelle sat beside her husband, which was a word she was quietly practicing in her mind, and observed the room with the particular attention of someone to whom rooms full of people had been forbidden for a long time. She noticed that the Duke watched her observe, and she noticed that he seemed to find it interesting rather than odd. At a quieter moment, when the table had dissolved into smaller conversations, and the afternoon light was beginning to angle through the dining room windows, he leaned slightly toward her and said, "But what are you thinking?" That I had forgotten what it felt like to be in a room where I was allowed to simply exist, she said. She had not planned to say something so direct and did not regret it. He was quiet for a moment. "You will always be allowed to simply exist here," he said, and the simplicity of it was precisely what made it land so completely. She looked at him. He met her eyes without the looking away of before, and she understood that the looking away had been a kind of fairness he was practicing, a deliberate restraint to give her room to arrive at things in her own time. She reached across and put her hand over his on the table. It was a small gesture, not dramatic, not performed for the room, though one or two people at the table did notice it, and Mrs. Petch made a sound into her teacup that she converted into a cough. His hand turned under hers and held it. Later, when the guests had gone, and the house had settled into its evening quiet, they walked together through the long corridor that ran along the back of the house, past the dark windows where the grounds were becoming indistinct in the early night. "Drusilla will contest the legal review," Orabel said, not anxiously, as a statement of fact. "She will try," the Duke agreed. "She will not succeed. Mr. Farwell has been thorough, and Mr. Grenby is formidable when he has something worth fighting for." "And Florette?" He considered. "She made a choice today. Coming. Bringing you the comb. Those were choices. People who begin making better choices tend to continue, given the right circumstances. You think circumstances can change people? I think people change themselves," he said. "Circumstances simply make it easier or harder." They walked a little further in the comfortable quiet. "I did not expect any of this," Orabel said. 3 weeks ago I was reading your letter by candlelight and telling myself that hope was dangerous." "Is it still?" She thought about it honestly. "I think the danger was in hoping without any possibility. This is different. This has ground under it." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The window beside them showed the dark lawn and the far tree line, and the first few stars beginning to appear in the cleared sky. "It has more than ground," he said, and turned to look at her, in the way he had been doing since the first day, directly, without decoration, seeing exactly what was there. "It has an intention behind it, at least on my part." The corridor was very quiet. "And on mine," she said. She had spent 3 years in a veil. 3 years made small, made absent, made into a problem her stepmother had solved by erasing her from every room she should have occupied. She had endured it with patience and with pride, and with a steady internal refusal to become what Drusilla had wanted her to become, which was someone who believed the veil was deserved. She had never believed that. And standing here now, in this wide and warm and enduring house, beside a man who had looked at her face and held her hand and meant every plainly spoken word he had ever said to her, she felt the last of the 3 years settle and release, not disappear. It had happened, and it had shaped her, and she would carry the mark of it always. But it no longer had weight. It no longer pressed. She was Orabel Thorne. now Orabelle Drave, and Duchess of Ashenmore. She was her father's daughter and her mother's child, and her own person, fully and without apology. The Duke of Ashenmore looked at her in the quiet corridor and said nothing more, because nothing more was needed. She looked back at him with her face open and her eyes clear, and thought that this was what it felt like when the door that had shown you the thinnest line of light finally, properly, swung open. Not a dramatic flood of it. Not a blinding, sudden blaze. Just light. Steady and honest and entirely real, filling every corner where the dark had been.